Torrential downpours, unrelenting floods, and unbearable heat. Is the world prepared as the climate crisis ramps up? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. July marked the hottest month on record, impacting more than 80% of the global population. Wildfires scorched parts of Canada and Greece, while temperatures skyrocketed in the United States and across Europe. Meanwhile, China is reeling from the impact of Typhoon Doksuri. Beijing saw the heaviest rainfall in at least 140 years, and rescue and recovery efforts are now underway. We begin this show with CGTN's Huang Yue, who has this report from Beijing.
I'm now in western Beijing's Mentogo district, which has experienced severe flooding during the recent heavy rainfall. And after over 70 hours of continuous rain, as you can see now, the flood waters have receded and the recovery work is still underway. In the downtown area of Mentogo district, powerful floods leave behind thick, blood-soaked mud. Sanitation crews, along with government workers and volunteers, are busy cleaning up the main street as the first step in dealing with the aftermath of flash flooding. Some small shops along the river have been hit hard by flood waters, and the shop owners return to clean up the damage in their stores.
We came to check the store at 7 a.m. and we couldn't even get inside. The floor was full of silt.
I live upstairs in this building, so I saw the water surging and realized my shop would be flooded. This morning when I came to check, some of the trousers and shoes were soaked in water, totaling about 2,000 yuan.
Such losses are still in a manageable range, but others have suffered a much bigger disaster.
It's a great loss. More than 100,000 yuan of tea leaves were soaked in water, which means they are ruined. I have no choice but to throw them away. I grew up here, and I've had the store for over 10 years. I have never seen such heavy rains.
All these electronic devices, computers, printers, paper, they've been exposed to flood water. I haven't calculated the losses, but it's no less than tens of thousands of yuan. I still haven't switched on the electricity as there is still water.
So far, the urban areas of Mentogo district have resumed electricity and water supplies. But the rescue operation in remote villages is still ongoing as the floods cut off roads, power, and drinking water. As of Thursday afternoon, all the villages in the district, which had lost contact with the outside world, were reconnected. Shelters have been set up in nearby schools for villagers affected by the disaster. Huang Yue, CGTN, Beijing.
Okay, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us right here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. From Seattle, Yixing is the former research director of Breakthrough Energy. We also have Michael Shank. He is the director of engagement at the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and adjunct professor of sustainable development at New York University. And from Beijing, we're joined by Changhua. She is the China director for the office of Jeremy Rifkin. Welcome to all of you to the show. Changhua, let me start with you. You are in Beijing, and we have seen the pictures of those floods in Beijing. Torrential rains hit the city. And as I said, it's the most serious flooding we've seen in the past 140 years in Beijing. Now, the city is not new to this kind of flooding, but why were this year's rains so severe?
A lot of studies actually have been pointing the direction that against the backdrop of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, as well as the return of El Nino, which is a cyclic warming period in the Pacific tropics there, climate change definitely is the major reason everyone is pointing finger to, and we need to think about it, what was happening and bearing the consequences at this moment and trying to figure out what to do next. So if just look at the news report or the pictures, articles, videos, TV programs, whatever direction you look at this moment, it's really devastating to see the devastation and the flooding, and particularly the mudslides in the suburban area in Mentogo, and also in surrounding areas in Hebei province. A couple of other cities literally flooded in order to help relax the situation. As reported early on, I think the recovery is underway, and we still don't have the number calculated yet in terms of the losses, but we know there are lives lost. And if you look at the damage to the infrastructure, property, you name it, I think the final point is that the society, our infrastructure, particularly building infrastructure, as well as our ecosystems, are not equipped to fight against the climate change. One additional point, actually, flooding has been very common to this part of the world, of the country. And if you look at it globally, 42% of the recorded disasters in the last few decades actually are flooding. And it's just intensity, frequency, the longer duration, and the strength of those disasters somehow put us under test in terms of how resilient we'll be. And again, it's proven that we are not capable to fight over such kind of disasters. We need to look deeper to figure out how to address the emission issues and fight climate change.
Abdullahi, of course, the impact of climate change is being felt throughout the world. And if you look at the flooding that we saw in China, as Changhua just pointed out, there's no country that's actually prepared for this, that is equipped to cope with these kinds of natural disasters. But let's talk about the continent of Africa, where we could see some of the most serious consequences of climate change. One of those consequences is food insecurity. There's water shortages that could happen. There's climate refugees that could cause a crisis. And then, of course, underpinning all of this is the question of cost. What is your assessment of Africa's ability to, to cope with the kinds of changes that we're seeing?
I think Africa is probably, if I may, the least prepared continent, because there are already inherent structural weaknesses that have been allowed to fester. And as such, it will be very difficult. Because the thing about climate change is that it makes the already existing challenges by compounding them. For instance, let's take a country like Somalia. This is a country that has not had a stable government since 1991. Subsequently, also, it is a region of the world that is currently in the front line of the climate change. As a result, because you don't have a strong government to begin with, so what you have is they become even more vulnerable when they are hit by the climate change. Just an example. Over the last few years, I think 5 consecutive failed rain at the end of last year almost led to, the second round of famine in Somalia. So Somalia tends to be the basket case, but there are many other countries. I think also, speaking about climate change, it takes many forms. In the sense that in some parts like Somalia, you do have, let's say, flooding. It becomes something akin to drought. But you go to South Sudan, not the whole of South Sudan, but in some parts, you see flooding, and all of them have a bearing on governance, food insecurity, and the general livelihood. So Africa is potentially the least prepared. I'll give other guests a chance, but I want to speak about also the question of equity and green, clean transition.
Yixing, the Northern Hemisphere has been experiencing extreme heat waves. As I said, July was the hottest month on record. There was a report which was issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and part of this report said, and I'm going to quote it here, it said, human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming, with global surface temperatures reaching 1.1 degrees Celsius above 1850 to 1900 in 2011 to 2020. So we have been warned about the rise in temperatures for a long time, and we have seen the rise taking place. But it seems recently we've seen a sudden rise. What is happening? Why is it happening so quickly?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So first is that the global is warming continuously. Even we somehow magically stop emission today, it's going to continue to warm for roughly 70 years before the temperature comes down. And recently, the warming becomes even worse, or the temperature rises much faster than previously expected. One of the main reasons is the El Nino is going to start this year. And it's very likely we all need to keep this in mind that the next 5 years is going to be very hot because of the kind of the double impact from both reasons. One is global warming, another one is the El Nino. And it's very likely that one of the next 5 years will be the hottest year ever recorded in the world. So a lot of things are changing, and it's unfortunate that even we know global warming is happening, but I still don't feel that there is a very strong sense of urgency. Even countries like China, United States, and Europe are taking a lot of steps to move forward to fight climate change, but I still feel it's not enough, and we still need the speed and scale to really deploy what the mature technologies we already have, like wind and solar, battery, and the EVs. And at the same time, we also need to government needs to have policies to incentivize, such as using tax credits to help relatively new or emerging technologies like green hydrogen, direct air capture, etc., to help them become more commercialized in the next 5 to 10 years. Meanwhile, we really need the government to heavily spend money on R&D to develop new technologies, such as nuclear fusion and other technologies, which may not be ready in the next 5 to 10 years, but may have a huge impact or potential in the next 10 to 20 years to help us fight climate change. Because now the goal is really to get to net zero by 2050 or 2060, and now we need to deploy the capitals and to fund the mature technologies and help the new emerging technologies to become mature in the next several decades. So I think we really need this sense of urgency. Otherwise, it's very likely that the temperature is going to rise faster than we thought, and we won't be prepared.
Michael Shank, welcome to the show. We got some information that is making a lot of news. The European Union climate change monitor, Copernicus, says that oceans have hit their hottest ever recorded temperatures. The average daily global sea surface temperature broke the record set 7 years ago. It reached almost 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. What is going on? Why are surface temperatures on oceans rising so fast?
Yeah, oceans are absorbing a lot of that carbon, absorbing a lot of that heat, and it's appropriate that we're talking today, given the timeliness of the conversation, and that we're breaking records all month, all year, and certainly today with the oceans hitting record temps too. There was a poll this week by NPR, National Public Radio, and PBS in the United States showing that 2/3 of Americans are feeling climate hit home more than ever before. And so this is a real opportunity. I mean, the panelists have laid out, and your correspondent has laid out the urgency and the need to act fast to counter climate change and its extreme weather. And so there is a real opportunity now because people are seeing it from China to India to the United States to Europe to Russia. People are seeing the impacts all around them hit home at a severity we've not seen before, not certainly in our lived lifetime. And so how do we make sure we connect the dots for people? I'll give a quick example. So I just moved from the state of Vermont. I'm now in Washington, D.C. And as folks may know, there's been a lot of flooding in the state of Vermont because warmer air holds more moisture, and then it just dumps, and you get these torrential rains, which create the flooding. Well, in the days following that flooding, nobody was talking about climate change. No one was putting the flooding in context. The governor wasn't, Vermont media weren't, and it was a real missed opportunity. Now they are. They finally got to it, but there's a real missed opportunity to really seize this moment to message and connect the dots for everyone so that they understand the climate changing context in which this extreme weather is happening. No one does this better than UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who recently talked about global boiling. So that need to connect the dots for people is real.
Michael, one other thing about ocean surface temperatures rising. I mean, what kind of impact, or what are the implications of that for the rest of our environment? You know, will it affect weather patterns, climate? How will we feel that?
Yeah, certainly it's going to melt any remaining ice that we're seeing increasingly melt on the caps. You know, Arctic ice is the lowest it's ever been. And so not only is it going to melt remaining ice, but it's going to create worse storms, which impact our coastal cities. I work with a lot of cities that are seeing the sea level rise and storm surge worsen over the years because of warmer oceans, which are making for worse hurricanes. So it's all connected. So we're going to see migration and cities having to relocate. We're already seeing this in Indonesia, for example, Jakarta, political capital, having to relocate out of Jakarta. And so we're going to see a lot of migration as a result. And why our cities are responding with urgency is because lives are impacted. And so how do we both cool the planet by decarbonizing and stop burning fuels while also saving lives and cooling urban heat islands and giving cooling centers and resilience hubs for citizens to save themselves amidst these unprecedented heat waves? So it's tough for cities because they're on the front lines of this work to both cool the urban heat island effect by offering cooling centers and opening swimming pools for longer seasons, et cetera, while also cutting carbon and decarbonizing. We have to do both because the urgency is now.
Changhua, Michael was talking there about the United Nations Secretary General, who's made a lot of speeches and said a lot about climate change and the need for us to act very quickly. Well, he has also been talking about the impact that climate change has been having on the global economy. Let's listen to him. Antonio Guterres.
Many banks, investors and other financial actors continue to reward polluters and incentivize wrecking the planet. We need a course correction in the global financial system so that it supports accelerated climate action. That includes putting a price on carbon and pushing the multilateral development banks to overhaul their business models and approaches to risk.
So, Changhua, I mean, we hear very often, as we've heard on the show so far, the urgency, the need to combat climate change as soon as possible. But is there also, I mean, listening to the Secretary General there, is there also a failure on the part of some to recognize that we're facing a crisis? Are they effectively putting, as you've heard before, profits over the planet?
Well, that's a good question. I think as we were talking about here today, we literally live in the crisis, unprecedented, record-making sort of crisis of floods, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, you name it there. But somehow we also know what the solution should be. And we have all the policy tools, if not all of them, most of them already. And we have the technologies, we have certain industrial value chains built up already, but somehow the actions are just slow, too slow, and wouldn't be able to match up with what's needed in terms of really fight the crisis at this moment. Let me add a little bit sort of the level of crisis. And as we all know, we are already at this 1.2 degrees Celsius warming world already. And for every 1 degree Celsius warming, and the air sucks up 7% more humidity actually into the atmosphere. So we rely on the flow of the air streams and the jet streams as well as the current streams actually in order to circulate to re-regulate the temperature of the planet. But somehow with the warming, and we started to see air jet streams movement dramatically weakened and slowed down. So you started to see heat domes forming up in patches in different parts of the world in the air. And in the meantime, you mentioned about the ocean, the surface temperature. Ocean covers about 70% of the planet's area and sucks up 90% of CO2s. And so it's a huge sort of regulator of the temperature on this planet as well as a carbon sink. Now, scientists are telling us, and the sea surface temperature has been increasing, has been rising at a record level as well. What does that tell us? That tells us that the oceans is sort of saturated already, wouldn't be able to suck more or absorb more heat. Basically start to release the heat into the atmosphere. That really further complicates the climate system, actually mechanism of the planet. That's the sense of crisis with all the factors coming together. That's why we are experiencing the unprecedented water stress of this planet at this moment. Now, back to the action part. I think Mike mentioned actually the U.S. and the situation with Vermont, particularly you mentioned about this recent survey. There is also another side of the story of the survey that about three-quarters of Republican voters in the U.S. still feel like climate change is not a priority, and economic growth is. So you started to see the continued politicization of climate change issues, clean energy transition issues there. So there are many barriers, hurdles in reality we need to examine. Why we are not moving faster, even though we've been talking the same language, sending the sense of urgency in the last couple of decades, particularly recent decade, but still our actions are too slow movement, and we just wouldn't be able to step up to fight the crisis. As a consequence, we have to bear the losses and the sufferings that we literally are living through the hell. Actually, that's the issue on the table. I think we all need to think harder.
Abdullahi, have there any studies been done, any serious studies been done into the impact of climate change on things like, I mentioned the climate refugee situation, but the displacement of people, and also things like national security in many countries that probably can tell us what we can expect in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think there is a direct link between national security in any of these countries, between climate change and national security. You mentioned, let me take first the displacement. Mm-hmm. I think, again, if you look at Somalia, because of last couple of years of drought, most people who generally rely on pastoralism as their way of livelihood, once their stock are decimated, majority of them have moved into cities, but mostly Mogadishu. What happens is these are people who have for 5, 6, whatever generations, the only mode of livelihood they know is livestock. They don't know anything. They just know that. Now they are all concentrated in Mogadishu and other urban centers. As a result now, they are largely rendered IDPs. So you have to figure out how to now program for those people, because they are not in a sense, what you would call traditional IDPs, but they are IDPs nonetheless now. The programming now needs to take different shape. Around Lake Chad Basin, where, it's also part of the Sahel, one of the biggest problems that is hardly spoken about is the fact that the decreasing capacity of Lake Chad is causing tremendous amount of conflict between cattle keepers and herders. As a result, you're seeing more conflict. As a result, you're seeing more displacement. The thing about climate change is it can literally be connected to every aspect of our habitation. As a result, therefore, yeah, there is a direct link. I just want to make 2 points. One, while we're living through unprecedented time, I find sometimes policymakers, including people like ourselves, we just sit there and admire the problem. Everybody knows that. I think at least the majority of the population understand that this climate change, what we are experiencing, really is unprecedented. The severity and the frequency is not something that we've seen. Every year we say record broken, but little is done because there's no political will. The reason why there's no political will is the last 2 years, the 8 or 9 major fossil fuel companies or corporations made blockbuster profits. Yeah. Just the last quarter, the first quarter of 2023, they made 100 billion. In 2022, they made close to 200 billion. So we are talking about people who have put profit above anything else. As a result, we are having the challenges that we are having.
Michael Shank, what is your view on that? I mean, of course, the crisis, the debate has become very politicized, especially here in the United States. Recently, the United States Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, he wrote that to face the crisis, we must act quickly on 2 fronts: fostering international cooperation and holding accountable those responsible for the crisis in the first place. And in fact, there was an opinion piece in the Financial Times which said, I'm quoting here, the dilemma is how to balance climate action with the preservation of livelihoods. So there's a number of moving pieces here. There's preservation of livelihoods, there's combating climate change, and of course, as Abdullahi pointed out a moment ago, there are companies making record profits.
I think two things are needed. One, we need to make it about lives that are bettered with a decarbonized future. So rather than about the climate science or the climate data, it's about a better life. So if we're building pedestrian-friendly cities, how is life better for people? If we're encouraging people to be energy secure with solar panels and battery backup, how is life better? How are you more energy independent or energy secure in that environment? If we're encouraging people to be more plant-based in their diets, how is life better? How is health better? So in any and all of this, it's really about how are we making lives better for people, and then messaging around that. Secondly, something we're encouraging our cities to do, and where our cities are leading, is we're getting rid of silos, because historically, as everyone knows, you had an environment department or a sustainability department or a climate department. And as Abdullahi mentioned, this is impacting every aspect of our lives. So really taking the emphasis away from this label like the environment or the climate, and really making it about every aspect of governance.
Yixing, India will be hosting the next G20 summit that'll take place next month in September. There was already a meeting before that. That was the G20 Environment and Climate Ministers meeting. That didn't achieve much. So what are your expectations of the Leaders Summit, which will take place next month?
Yeah, honestly, I'm expecting quite a lot for every year for this COP meeting. And hopefully this year, I think for the very first time, all the governments in the world are going to do a global stock take. That means that all the countries need to understand their emissions very well, and also understand and track their progress towards reducing those emissions from now on. And I think for sure that a lot of countries will find out that they are way off the goals they need to achieve. But that's okay. That's a very good starting point. We don't want to naming and shaming any other countries, but I think in the conference that the people for the first time fully understand globally what are the emissions and what are the progress, and this is a very good starting point. I also expect that more countries are reporting the large-scale deployment of renewable energy, and also the better finance for fighting climate change.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Have a good weekend.